At Gettysburg, Lieutenant Colonel Freeman McGilvery commanded the 1st Volunteer Artillery Brigade from the Union's Artillery Reserve. On July 2nd, all 4 of his batteries saw heavy action in the Peach Orchard and the Trossel Farm Field. As Sickles' situation became dire, late in the afternoon, McGilvery took the initiative in establishing a makeshift defensive artillery line that contained, at various times through the evening hours, 7 batteries from 5 different artillery brigades. This is the story of the McGilvery Line, also known as the Plum Run Line. The video is extracted from over 40 hours of animation, covering the entire Gettysburg battlefield on July 1st and 2nd. For more information about this acclaimed work, visit the website referenced above. After having arrived to the Artillery Reserve area during the 10 o'clock hour, McGilvery's 4 batteries, Thompson's, Hart's, Bigelow's, and Phillips's, remained in park until about 3:30 p.m. Historical records are ambiguous about the order in which the batteries departed for the Peach Orchard. McGilvery's official report states, after having received an order to report to General Sickles with 2 batteries, he sent the 5th Massachusetts Battery, Captain Phillips, and the 9th Massachusetts Battery, Captain Bigelow. Brigadier General Tyler, in his command of the Artillery Reserve, reported it differently, stating that it was Hart's 15th New York and Phillips's batteries that were initially dispatched to Sickles. But numerous other sources espouse what author James Woods, in his highly detailed study Gettysburg, July 2nd, The Ebb and Flow of Battle, shows in his book, specifically that Hart, then Bigelow, moved toward the Trossel Farm first, followed by Phillips. Regardless of their order of arrival, shortly after 4 p.m., 3 of McGilvery's batteries were deployed along the Wheatfield Road and actively engaged against the Confederate infantry and artillery to their south. McGilvery's 4th Battery, Thompson's combined batteries C and F Pennsylvania, would join the other 3 in the Peach Orchard after an initial side trip to the east side of Cemetery Hill. In Captain Thompson's remarks at his battery's monument dedication ceremony, he wrote, quote, "About 3 o'clock, we were placed in battery, overlooking the Baltimore Pike, in the rear of Cemetery and Culp's Hill," unquote. And so it is that from this location, in his official report, Thompson writes, quote, "At about 4:30, an aide to General Meade arrived with orders to limber up and proceed to the Peach Orchard at the double quick," unquote. When Thompson's battery relieves Ames' 1st New York Battery G in the Peach Orchard, or takes up a position in support of Ames to his right, and there are numerous historical accounts of both, McGilvery now has 4 batteries blazing away in defense of Sickles' exposed salient. After the intense fighting at the Peach Orchard and along the Wheatfield Road south of the Trossel Farm had been going on for over an hour, both 3rd Corps and Artillery Reserve batteries were rapidly withdrawing to the east. There was much crowding and confusion at the now famous gate in the northeast corner of the field. The chaos was further exacerbated by the traffic of men and guns simultaneously passing to the east along the Trossel Farm Lane. McGilvery, as did virtually all of the other Union general officers, realized the salient was collapsing. The situation for the 3rd Corps infantry and its batteries, as well as the Artillery Reserve batteries, was dire. In his report, McGilvery wrote, quote, "The crisis of the engagement had now arrived. I gave Captain Bigelow orders to hold his position as long as possible, at all hazards, in order to give me time to form a new line of artillery about 400 yards to the rear," unquote. After the last battery made it out, Bigelow was left alone in the corner of the field to make a sacrificial last stand. After instructing Bigelow, McGilvery raced east into the field just to the north of Weichert Woods and east of the north branch of Plum Run. There he began to intercept retreating artillery pieces, headed his way from the Trossel Farm area. Many guns had already moved past this reorganizational point, specifically Buckland, Hart, with two of Phillips's guns, and Clark. But he did stop the withdrawal of Phillips's center and left sections, and Thompson's battery, and he ordered them to deploy in a line. 3 of Thompson's guns and 1 of Phillips's guns were subsequently deemed unserviceable, and they were ordered to the rear. But it turned out that the 5 remaining guns were not alone on this makeshift line, plus additional help was on the way. About 2 hours earlier, 3 batteries of Martin's 5th Corps Brigade arrived along the section of the Wheatfield Road where it passes north of Little Round Top. They briefly halted there. The batteries were Watson's 4-gun 1st U.S. Battery I, Walcott's 3rd Massachusetts Battery C, and Hazlitt's 5th U.S. Battery D, both comprised of 6 guns. While Hazlitt had a date with Destiny at the summit of Little Round Top, Watson and Walcott moved a bit further east and took up initial positions near the J.T. Weichert farm. Colonel Chamberlain of the 20th Maine referenced the position when he later remembered, quote, passing an open field in the hollow ground in which some of our batteries were going into position, unquote. It was a marshy ground and strewn with boulders and not suited for artillery. And as such, Captain Martin left the batteries under command of a staff officer, while he scouted for more optimal positions. When positions were subsequently identified, and orders sent back for the batteries to move to the front, they could not be found. Walcott's battery, Martin reported, was later, quote, found in the rear of the 3rd Corps. The officer commanding reported that he had been ordered there by an officer from General Sickles' staff, who had orders to take any battery he could find, no matter where they belonged, unquote. Watson's battery was commandeered the same way. There are no official reports for either battery, and it's only their reference in other reports and documents of others that enables the piecing together of where and when they moved elsewhere, and how they eventually ended up on McGilvery's line later in the day. The detailed look at Walcott and Watson's early movements is essential to understanding how they became part of the McGilvery line. In Walcott's case, it has been established that the battery was missing when Martin tried to issue deployment orders, and that later he was found. These 2 facts become the basis for the conclusion that Walcott's battery was the battery that McGilvery stated, when describing his makeshift line, as being, quote, the unnamed volunteer battery, which I have never been able to learn the name of, unquote. While no one is sure exactly how far west Walcott may have moved when his battery was hijacked by Sickles, or exactly to where they withdrew back to the east, numerous authors, including James Woods, reference the one fact that is fairly clear. That battery spent a brief time in the vicinity of the left flank of McGilvery's line. When McGilvery later wrote, quote, the unknown volunteer battery heretofore mentioned left the field, unquote, it was due to Martin finding him and ordering him back toward the Weichert farm lane, where a subsequent deadly struggle with Wolford's brigade would take place. With respect to the other 5th Corps battery, there are 2 precursor threads when reconstructing the possible movements of Watson leading up to a deployment location that would subsequently become the McGilvery line. In one thread, Harry Fonce, in his book Gettysburg the Second Day, has Watson leaving his initial position and relieving Ames's battery at the Peach Orchard. Fonce cites the 2nd New Hampshire Regimental Report stating that, during their assault of Kershaw, they charged through an unnamed battery that replaced Ames. In the other thread, author James Woods described a movement that would have Watson never reaching the Peach Orchard, but instead relieving Ames as he paused during his withdrawal at the Trossel Farm. Authors James Hessler and Britt Eisenberg, in their book Gettysburg's Peach Orchard, in addition to their commentary on both threads, have nearly a full page of footnotes discussing both Watson Peach Orchard scenarios. Since an animation cannot illustrate multiple scenarios, and this work uses fonts as the primary narrative, Watson is shown taking up position in the peach orchard. But for the purpose of this study, either location can serve as the starting point for Watson's subsequent withdrawal to the western edge of the Weikert Woods. There they took up a nondescript position that would minutes later become part of the McGilvery line. It was shown earlier that when McGilvery halted portions of Phillips's and Thompson's batteries during their respective flights from the peach orchard, that these 5 guns were not alone, and more help was on the way. As has now been shown, Walcott and Watson were to the left of the position at which McGilvery's 5 guns were unlimbered. His line to hopefully stop Barksdale's advance now had 15 guns. The assistance en route was a fresh 4-gun battery of Dow, the 6th Maine Battery F, part of Fitzhugh's Reserve Brigade. As Sickles' salient position continued to crumble, Dow, the next-to-last unused battery in the Artillery Reserve Park, was ordered to the front. The battery arrived shortly after McGilvery gave his initial instructions to Phillips and Thompson. With Dow's deployment, there were now 19 guns on the line, but that number would soon change again. Shortly after Dow arrived, the unknown battery described in McGilvery's report, and that author James Woods has made the case for being Walcott's, left the field. As previously shown, they departed from McGilvery's left after receiving orders from Martin to join the 5th Corps' fight to the south. Walcott repositioned his battery on the Weikert farm lane and aggressively engaged the Confederates during their final push through the wheat field. In a little more than a half hour, his battery was overrun by Wofford's brigade, but later was recovered by Nevin's 6th Corps brigade when Wofford was ordered by Longstreet to disengage and withdraw. The next piece of McGilvery's line to go was Watson's battery. Barksdale's 21st Mississippi Regiment was aggressively advancing to the east, detached and to the south of Barksdale's main line. When they overran Bigelow's battery, McGilvery's worst fear had come true. Bigelow held his position at all costs, and the battery was decimated. 80 horses were killed, and casualties were over 25%. 4 guns were captured. And now, the 21st Mississippi's next target was Watson, about 300 yards further east on the farm lane. As with the other batteries on McGilvery's line, there was no organized Union infantry to Watson's front. Even with aggressive canister fire, the 21st Mississippi captured Watson's battery. Watson was wounded and lost his leg, and half the battery's horses were shot. Fonz described the scene, writing, quote, "The men of the 21st Mississippi tried to turn their captured guns on the former owners, but could not do so. The gun crews had carried off their tools and friction primers, and the guns could not be loaded, aimed, or fired." Unquote. McGilvery's line had dwindled to 9 guns. In McGilvery's report, he writes, quote, "As soon as Dow's battery reported, which was just before sundown, I ordered canister to be used on the low bushes in the front." Unquote. In those bushes that lined both banks of Plum Run were Barksdale's Mississippians, advancing closer and closer toward the batteries and Willard's brigade forming in their rear. The close-range canister fire, coupled minutes later with the charge of Willard's 125th and 126th New York regiments, compelled Barksdale to retire. While McGilvery's line played a major role in thwarting Barksdale, fierce fighting continued to both the north and south. During this time, the makeshift line of batteries was further unraveling. At about the same time that Watson was being overrun, Thompson's 2 guns exhausted their ammunition. They limbered and headed for the rear. But by this time, Willard's 125th and 126th New York regiments had charged Barksdale and were beginning to push him back. Meanwhile, the 39th New York was dispatched to halt the 21st Mississippi from advancing further east and using Watson's guns. With the 39th New York rapidly approaching, and seeing that Barksdale's main line was falling back, Faunce writes, quote, "Colonel Humphreys realized that there was nothing to be gained from tarrying by Watson's guns, which he could neither fire nor readily drag away," unquote. The 21st Mississippi withdrew, leaving Watson's guns back in the hands of the Federals, but they were unusable. And factoring in Thompson's departure, the McGillivray line was down to 7 guns. Minutes after Thompson withdrew, Rorty's 4-gun battery, the 1st New York Battery B, briefly joined the line. Sometimes erroneously referred to as Pettit's Battery, named after its original commander, Captain Rufus Pettit, it was led to Gettysburg by 1st Lieutenant Albert Sheldon, who was temporarily in command. By mid-morning of Day 2, it was in front of Caldwell's 1st Division, southwest of the present-day Pennsylvania Memorial. Initially part of the artillery reserve, the battery was transferred to the 2nd Corps on the eve of the battle. Major General Hancock gave Captain James Rorty the command. But by early evening, Sheldon was still in command, and the battery, still at its morning position, was heavily engaged. During their heroic charge, the 1st Minnesota entered the battery's field of fire. It was forced to adjust its position, and as reported by Captain Hazard, quote, "conformed its movements to the retrograde movements of the infantry, gaining a more commanding position upon the crest of the hill," unquote. Author James Woods postulates, quote, "the exact location was most likely southeast of the 1st Minnesota position," unquote. Exactly how this 2nd Corps battery would end up on McGillivray's line is speculative, since there are few recorded details of its action on Day 2. Neither Rorty, who was killed on July 3rd, nor Lieutenant Sheldon filed official reports. But now within sight of McGillivray, to his right and slight rear, Woods explains further that, quote, "Lieutenant Colonel Warner of the Artillery Reserve was apparently able to persuade Lieutenant Sheldon to move the 1st New York Battery B to support McGillivray's line, because Sheldon had not yet turned his command over to Captain Rorty and officially joined the 2nd Corps," unquote. It was dusk. The rebel infantry was well into their withdrawal. McGillivray's guns, their number back up to 11, fired at them to the west, and also continued counter-battery fire against Alexander's guns in the Peach Orchard. As darkness was setting in, the crisis of the engagement of which McGillivray wrote had passed. After firing just a few rounds, deciding the guns would be put to better use elsewhere, Rorty's battery limbered up and moved back near their original 2nd Corps position. As Rorty was leaving, 2 sections of Seeley's 4th U.S. Battery K, now commanded by Lieutenant Robert James, was arriving. During the late afternoon hours, this 3rd Corps battery had fought valiantly out on the Emmitsburg Road, where Lieutenant Francis Seeley, the battery's original commander, was wounded. They withdrew to the Artillery Reserve area. There the battery replenished its ammunition, and James cobbled together 4 operational guns from the wreckage of his battery, and subsequently headed for McGillivray's line. The next battery to leave the line was Dow's, but before the battery withdrew, McGillivray ordered Dow to personally, quote, "go to the front and see if any other public property was on the field," unquote. Dow later reported that he, quote, "discovered 4 light 12-pounder guns and a limber of the 9th Massachusetts Battery. The remnant of the 150th New York Regiment, though tired and weary, took hold of the guns and ran them up to Lieutenant James's position," unquote. Though Dow noted 4 guns, the 150th dragged back only 3 guns of Bigelow's decimated battery. They were eventually left behind James's battery in the growing darkness where, because the guns were without horses or limbers, they spent the night of July 2nd. In James Woods' book, he cites 2 reports that place Dow's departure time between 7:30 and 8 p.m. Dow reported, quote, "I was relieved by McGilvery, who placed Seeley's battery in my position," unquote. After leaving the line, Dow's battery unlimbered briefly at the edge of the woods in the rear. There they waited for Watson's recovered guns to be hauled back to their flank. McGilvery's line was back at 7 guns. Part of Dow's earlier reconnaissance also discovered the fact that Watson's guns were still on the field. He reported, quote, "The enemy had retired from the field in haste and had not taken the captured guns with them, nor even spiked them," unquote. Dow sent as many men as he could spare to bring them off the field, and in speaking of the efforts of Lieutenant Rogers of his battery, he wrote, quote, "With the aid of the Garibaldi Guard of New York, he bought off, under fire from the enemy sharpshooters, 4 3-inch rifled guns and 2 limbers belonging to Company I, 5th Regulars, which we immediately limbered to our caissons and ran to the rear," unquote. The detachment of men from the 39th New York nursed Watson's recovered guns back to Dow's new position, where he had been waiting. Together, sharing the necessary horses, caissons, and limbers, the 2 batteries then moved to the artillery reserve rear. About the time that the recovered guns of Bigelow and Watson were being hauled back, Phillips's 3 guns withdrew. Phillips reported that his battery remained in its McGilvery line position, quote, "till dark, when the rebels were pretty well checked, and I was out of ammunition. I retired across the Taneytown Road and unhitched for the night," unquote. His partial battery had been the first elements of this famous defensive line, and now, with the exception of the post-sundown arrival of Seeley's battery, who stayed all night, Phillips was the last to leave the line. The McGilvery line was reconstituted during the pre-dawn and early morning hours of July 3rd. After reloading their ammunition caissons and making what repairs they could during the night in the Artillery Reserve Park, virtually all of the batteries, or portions thereof, that had been engaged on the line during the early evening hours of Day 2 took up new positions. It is pretty much the Day 3 positions of the batteries that are memorialized along the present-day southern portion of Hancock Avenue. From these commemorative locations, the artillery took part in the heavy cannonade that preceded Pickett's charge, as well as the fierce fighting during the climactic battle. But as has been shown, it is the relatively unmarked field to their front and west of this monument line where McGilvery and the 7 different batteries he coordinated formed the famous McGilvery Line. Visit our website to register to use this app and explore anywhere, anytime on the battlefield. www.civilwaranimatedbattles.com